without further ado, Assalamu alaikum, David. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you. The story is I converted to Islam in 1991, so about 35 years ago. It was also a time. It was a time of a spiritual search, a search to, of course, that's coupled with an attempt to try to understand the world. And so, pretty much at the same time that I discovered Islam, and this is where it's important to, Islam. It gives you the basic history of the world, right? But it gives you a way to interpret and understand it. But obviously, there's a lot of detail in between. And this is where we come back to the question that you propose we cover. And that's, the need to understand. It's not just understanding history because it's a curiosity. It's, and I think this is a point that Muslims really don't get, is that because they've been influenced by a secular version of Islam, and this is something we can maybe talk a little bit more of how this happened. But basically, they've come to it's in many ways it's a way that they've adapted to living in the West. So they've created a version of Islam which is almost apolitical because they treat it as a set of rituals that can be practiced anywhere, and they forget, the more noble points and the real purpose and mission of Islam. So obviously, easily put, the purpose of a Muslim, the Prophet said, right, if you see something wrong, change it with your hand. If you see something, if you can't change it with your hand, change it with your mouth. If you can't change it with your mouth, then at least deny it in your heart, but that's the least of faith. So there's a clear obligation there to confront injustice. And that injustice manifests itself in different ways in different times. So if we are going to, so clearly there's injustice on a grand scale happening in our time, and if we want to confront it to fulfill our obligation as Muslims, then we need to understand it. So that's basically the purpose of my research. It's not just it's not a curiosity. It's an attempt to, I call it reconnaissance because that's the way I see it. It's an attempt to dissect and deconstruct the world that we're living in. So ideally, we can find ways to grapple with it, find ways to confront it, find ways to overcome it, find ways to change things for the better, and of course to ideally bring Islam and contribute ideally to a solution.
Yeah, no, and I think that point resonates with individuals, particularly me, quite massively. And it essentially comes back to the purpose of me inviting you on today, David, which you kindly accepted, and for a number of reasons, I'd say, because I'd say the biggest reason goes back to my childhood, where when I was young, and being a young Muslim from the West, there's been a significant number of telltale signs regarding this injustice, where things have not been seeming right, or things not seeming as they should be. So some of the first instances of that recognition hitting me would be attacks or terrorist organizations
Right.
being amplified on mainstream media, with these attacks or organizations claiming to be from Islam, but very much go against the fundamental principles of being a Muslim
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
message of Islam,
Yeah.
with, of course, mainstream media then only amplifying that false claim. And
Correct.
you begin to hear terms such as Wahhabism, which average everyday Muslims maybe had little or or no knowledge of prior. Um, and it starts to become prevalent and something that's discussed, but without many people understanding it. In addition to that, during that time in my youth, I was also coming across subjects that appeared separate, with those being matters pertaining to conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
The classic online Illuminati one eye symbolism thing.
Yeah.
Um, and for a very long time after that, I think for young Muslims or Muslims in general, especially in the West, these topics of terrorism or conspiracy theories very much stays in the back of their minds. It doesn't go beyond that, and there's a huge gap that people are left with where they kind of just go on with their lives, even though there's something very detrimental which they're unaware of, and people just don't take it any further. So this then brings me on to the state of Islam and Muslims, David, and I feel as though overall average everyday Muslims are under the impression that oh, things will work out, that we'll eventually go to heaven,
Yeah.
or they assume that just because there are so many Muslims in the world that they're all safe in some way. It's kind of like they're
Yeah.
hiding from reality, um,
Yeah.
and especially when it comes to some particular muftis who are quite famous online, promoting a warm, fuzzy sunshine and rainbow existence of Islam, you
Yeah.
know, how to be nice to your wife, etc. Now, I'm not saying they're bad
Exactly.
topics, but there's nothing that
Of
these
course.
people, yeah, there's nothing that these people discuss that help
Mm-hmm.
Muslims come to the realization that there appears to be something going on here, and the
Yeah.
problems aren't just going to disappear. So, this comes to my purpose for inviting you on, Brother David, and I was very much lost at that time in my youth, trying to bridge that gap in understanding these sinister things in our reality
Yeah.
for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Yeah.
wasn't until I came across an interview of yours a few years ago now with a sheikh, um, in which I felt as though your work bridged that gap that I was missing for all these years.
It's great.
So I've been speaking for a while now, but I guess what my question would be, David, is
Yeah.
what's your perspective on the state of Islam and Muslims today, and why do you think Muslims should take these matters a lot more seriously?
Yeah. So the 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 same is, of course, so that in mainstream media, conspiracy theory, of course, is now an insult, right? It's it's a term that's used to discredit entire theories, or not even theories, but basically, I mean, you look at now. It was conspiracy theory to talk about the influence of the Israel lobby, and that began to change with the Mearsheimer and Walt book, which was, I think, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago already now. There's a first shift, and now it's pretty common discussion, right? So, but Muslims are stuck with being afraid to broach the topic because it's embarrassing, right? They don't want to be affiliated with that kind of discussion, so they shy away from it, and then they end up in the kind of fuzzy, fluffy discussions like you talked about. I think there's a great hadith that says something along the lines that in the future the non-Muslims will come and they'll invite each other like feasters coming to share a feast. And for me, that sounds almost exactly like World War One, where the Ottoman Empire was dismembered, and everybody came to grab a piece. Right, so the Zionists, the British, the French, the Italians, everybody was fighting over to piece apart the Ottoman Empire at will. And so when the Sahaba heard this prophecy, then they asked, how could that be? The only thing they could imagine was that Muslims would have been a small number in that time, because in their mind this is not something they could conceive of. The Prophet said, no, he says here, I can't remember exactly what the wording was, but you would be an immense number. But the problem is that you would be polluted with a condition called wahan. And when they asked him what's wahan, he explained that it's love of life and fear of death. Right? So effectively it's enamored with this dunya and a fear to make the necessary sacrifice to stand up for what's right.
Mm.
This is a condition, because what you're talking about, I think it's fitra, right? It's our fitra to be concerned, to be bothered, to feel concerned about injustice, right? It's our fitra to want to do something about it, and that's the message of Islam. Islam's not like the Quran says, I don't want to dismiss it, but all the various actions are important. But the primary message of Islam is that this is the guarantee that Islam offers, right? It's the bargain that the Quran explains that this is what non-Muslims are not able to do. They're not able to make personal sacrifices because they think there's only here now. It's Islam that assures you that if you make this bargain, there's an eternity of in the afterlife that you'll be rewarded with for whatever you give up here.
Mhm.
And so only Muslim, well, only some Christians, of course, Jews in some cases as well. But I mean that's the message ultimately, that this is the message of Islam. This is the answer that the whole world is thirsting for, because this is how the media effectively operates, right? They basically inundate us with all kinds of temptations
Yeah.
to convince us that, because we all see the injustices, right? We see the poverty that's taking place. We see the genocides, the exploitation, the injustices that are happening, the inequalities that are happening, the lies that are happening, and everybody, most people, this is what's particularly difficult now, is a lot of people are experiencing a lot of this discomfort now when they see what's happening and they don't know what to do about it. And so this is effectively what the real message, the real propaganda that the media is trying to communicate, is that those problems are not your problem, right? What's happening in Iran, what's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening in Africa, just yes, those things are terrible, but go back and watch your Kardashians or whatever. That's the real message, that despite all the complicated political jargon or analysis and narratives that are preaching, the underlying message that they're trying to get people to absorb is to neglect their social responsibility, and to basically indulge in all kinds of you know wasteful pastimes. And that, again, that's the fundamental message of Islam. The message of Islam is that no, you cannot indulge yourself as you watch other people suffer. Your job, the reason why you've been put on this planet, is as a test to see how you'll respond to those injustices, and you'll be evaluated on the courage that you demonstrated to try to do something about it. And this is not new. This is why when you look at the message of the New Testament, if you look at the message of Jesus, the entire purpose of his mission was to, of course, this has been completely deformed by the various Christian denominations, where they focus on a lot of doctrinal issues. But really, if you read the New Testament yourself, you can see that what Jesus was trying to do is that the Jews of his time had so distorted the religion that they had turned it into basically a set of rituals, and they had lost what Jesus called the spirit of the law. And what he was asked to explain was the spirit of the law. He showed that it meant compassion, loving your neighbor. This is why he shared the story of the Good Samaritan and things like that, to try to bring Jews back to understanding, to go back to the original spirit. So Muslims are, like the Prophet said, that the Muslims would follow the people before them like a lizard into a hole. And when he was asked to, he explained the Jews and the Christians. So Muslims have made the same error, and they've basically turned Islam into a list of rituals that they can sort of carry in a suitcase from country to country and practice, regardless of what's happening around them. And this is why their message is not resonating. This is why. You know, they famously said that Islam is the fastest growing religion. And you ask most new Muslims, and they'll tell you the expression I always liked was, that new converts would explain that they came to Islam despite the Muslims. Right? A lot of Muslims come to Islam through the Quran, through their reading, not through contact with Muslims. So I think in general, that's an overall picture of the travesty that the Islamic world is currently living in. But then there's a way to understand how this came about. So the other point I wanted to broach is this fear of this idea of conspiracy, which is kind of tragic, because the entire message of Islam that we are intended to understand is that after God created Adam, Satan refused to bow down to him, so God punished him. Satan asked for respite. He asked for an opportunity until the day of judgment to do everything he could to mislead humanity. So the entire message of Islam is about a satanic, in this case, satanic conspiracy. And if when you read, of course, the Quran, as we all very well know, and this is just thing when you look at how the wording that's been used in the Quran, most of the time the word that is used is plotting or scheming or planning, right? When the real word that should probably be used is conspiracy. One of my favorite group of verses in the Quran, I can't remember what chapter it's in, but it's something along the lines where Allah describes how on the day of judgment you'll see the sort of the low fighting against the high, right? So the way I translate is sort of like the only words the equivalent words I can think of in English would be the masses arguing against the elite, and the elite complain against the masses complain to the elite, right, that it's their fault, and the elite basically excuse themselves and say that they were just misguided as well, and then the masses complain that it was a conspiracy that they carried out day and night to try to mislead them. And the sad reality is that both receive hellfire, right? So, and that's kind of part of the message of understanding this. It's not about isolating who the culprits are, who the conspirators are. There's a lot of a tendency to try to do that because there's a certain sort of psychological therapy that people undergo that it's easy to point the finger and have someone that you can criticize and condemn, but that's not really the purpose, right? The real purpose should be, because only Allah is the judge. We're not able to know how each individual is going to be judged, but the purpose is to understand what is happening so that at least we can save ourselves from it and ideally save others from it. So really what it comes down to, so really what my research comes down to is you could pretty much trace everything back to the verse of, it's in Surah Al-Baqarah, I think it's 101 to 102, and it talks about the angels Harut and Marut, right? So it says that the people of the book basically rejected their scripture, they apostatized, and they learned magic from the shayateen, which apparently was learned from Harut and Marut and was attributed to Solomon. And, it's amazing to see to what extent, how much, basically that's the origin of Freemasonry. So here we have a verse in the Quran that explains the origin of a secret society that is enormously influential in Western societies, that has often been a vehicle used to subjugate non-Muslim societies. And Muslims, I have not seen Muslims take any time at all to try to understand what that means, or even I'm surprised that even when I bring it up, they don't seem to really connect the dots. They don't really seem to be alerted to the significance of it. Wow. But basically that's most of my research for the last 35 years has been largely focused on that. So it's to understand, and it is actually interesting, it didn't start with the discovery of that hadith. It started because I started investigating the notion of the Aryan race, and I soon discovered that it was influenced by certain occult ideas, particularly a belief in Atlantis, and so it was developed in the late 1800s. And early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. So I was pretty shocked to find out that there were sort of bizarre esoteric ideas that had influenced what ended up being a very mainstream interpretation of history, because they were called Aryans then, and later, and also simultaneous Indo-Europeans. Now they refer to them as Caucasians, and the reason why this struck me is because this effective legend was still being taught in the university textbooks that I was receiving.
Wow.
And so when I started to understand how could these occult fringe beliefs possibly influence such a mainstream interpretation of history, and that's when I discovered Freemasonry. And then it was to find out, okay, so this Freemasonry, what is it? What influence does it have? Where does it originate? And what's interesting about it, Freemasonry, effectively, it originates only in the early 1700s, but it's based on ideas, occult, what we call occult ideas now, which can be traced back thousands of years. So now the Masons themselves trace the descent of their ideas, but the problem is it tends to get wrapped up in legends, right? Sometimes attributed to Moses or to Nimrod and characters like that. So it's important then to piece away the legend from the truth, and that's where the effort is. And so that's when I discovered through a clue that I read in David Musa Pitcock's, another British convert,
Satanic
his book
voices.
called Satanic Voices, and he made that connection, and it was a, it was a bold connection that I was shy to make, and I'm glad he made it because it basically encouraged me to follow through on it. And it's amazing how substantial this clue is, because what it seems to refer to is the birth of what today is called the Jewish Kabbalah, so it's a Jewish mystical tradition in Judaism. It was never called Kabbalah until the version that emerged after the 1100s is what's known as Kabbalah, but it's known to have had its origins going all the way back to the early centuries BC.
Okay.
And so the challenge is that when scholars are trying to figure out the origins of Kabbalah, because there's multiple influences in it. So there's some Persian elements, there's some Greek elements, there's some Egyptian elements, and they kind of argue to try to figure out, which came first. None of them are willing to propose that it was that it wasn't as ancient as the Kabbalah claims to be. They all recognize that it was a later production, but they weren't sure where it originated. And it's amazing that it's the Quran that provides that clue by localizing it in Babylon. And so most of my studies have been focused on, my early studies was focused on identifying what are known as the Magi, the Zoroastrian Magi, who were heretical Zoroastrians who adopted Babylonian magic. And their cult, basically, to make a long story short, spread to Greece, where it influenced Plato and Pythagoras, split to Egypt, where it influenced Hermeticism and Gnosticism. And through Gnosticism, a lot of Gnostic influences effectively influenced Catholic Christianity, which is why Christians worship Jesus as the Son of God. And to make a final point to allow you, ask me where we should go next. So this is the point I've been bringing up and realizing myself, especially after writing my latest book, is that there's a tendency in Western conspiracy studies to almost fixate on a sort of a Western tradition of this conspiracy, right? So there's a lot of characters who are considered foundational to it. People like the magician John Dee, Francis Bacon. In more recent times, people like H.P. Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, Edward Bulwer-Lytton. So they all tend to be, and what's interesting is most of these people tend to be spies, right? Going all the way back to John Dee, who was also a British spy. So they're always tended to be working overlapping in intelligence or basically imperial projects of Western imperial projects. And so we tend to look at Western nations largely as victims. But, if we want to go back to the Illuminati, so Illuminati was a real organization that was founded in 1766. I'm not sure it was as powerful as it was. There were several currents that were influential at the time. Martinism was a very important one. But people fixate on the Illuminati because, it's almost a convenient term. And so it's often used to refer to conspiratorial activities in our time, but supposedly the order was banned in 1785 or 87 or around there. So most academics insist that the group no longer exists, which is not really quite accurate because anybody who studies the subject properly knows that Weishaupt, the founder of the order, had intended to modify the order if they ever came into legal trouble, and it was only banned in the state of Bavaria, which didn't prevent it from flourishing everywhere else. So there's all kinds of theories that there's a couple of very important classics. There's Barruel, a famous Jesuit historian, who sometime after the French Revolution wrote an extensive study of the movement and traced the French Revolution back to the Illuminati. And so what's interesting is that already at this time, it's when you find a number of these historians start to trace the origins of the Illuminati back to first the Templars and then beyond them to the Ismaili assassins.
Mm.
And that's really where it gets interesting because this is really what I trace in my latest book is that this quote unquote conspiracy, you could trace it back to Babylon, but one of the most important stages in it was the founding of the Ismaili Shia group called the Hashishim, or known in English as assassins. And so the story goes, and this is not what I'm inventing, what I'm saying, this is the legend in occult societies in the West, is that the assassins effectively initiated the Templars, an order of crusading knights in the early 1100s, to their conspiracy, to their doctrines, and that's what we're experiencing ever since. So we want to get back to talk about the state of the Islamic world and how it's come to be what it is. A lot of it has been the effort of groups who claim descent from the assassins. So of course, the current leaders of the assassins, they're not called assassins anymore, but they're, the Ismaili, Nizari Ismaili community would be the Aga Khans. And so when you want to look at the entire history of how Islam was hijacked, was attacked, it was largely through agents who had associations or were associated with the Ismailis, the Ismailis in recent times. I believe the Muslim Brotherhood is an Ismaili front, and which is why you find that Ismailis continue to have a predominant role in the actions that are intended to dilute the Islamic message and have largely resulted in the state that we're suffering today.